Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming and braving what might be a snowstorm tonight. I'm Rhoda Shermer, and I'm the lucky president of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. We have a great program for you tonight. And but before we get on with it, I want to thank some of our partners, especially the Carroll Dickinson University people and the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley and the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn. They've been wonderful partners. Thank you so much. I also want to thank all of you who were able to donate tonight. Your tax-deductible donation helps us cover some of the expenses of our program. So I really appreciate it, and I thank you very much. So we're going to have a little bit of a different format tonight. We're going to provide a brief approach, a context to the program that we're doing tonight. Then I will introduce each speaker in the order of their speaking, and then we will have our moderator provide a discussion with these speakers, and then we will open it up to all of you for your questions. So I'm going to urge you to lean back, relax, listen to some great information, and then engage during the Q&A, okay? So Bob, if you would please come up and do your context, then I will introduce the speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Rhoda. Just want to set the stage here a little bit. As you know, the Network for Responsible Public Policy is a nonpartisan educational organization that provides information and discussion on important matters relating to public policy. Tonight, we are presenting speakers who will address the very controversial topic of gun control. Right off the bat, owning a gun is a constitutional right. Over time, and with an increase of population and urbanization, and the rising incidence of civilian gun-related violence and deaths, federal and state laws have been enacted, primarily since 1934 in the Roosevelt administration, to control these phenomena. In recent years, the right to own a gun and the laws and regulations passed by the federal government and the states to affect their ownership and use has resulted in the polarization of opinion on how the subject should be politically managed. Recent mass killings at schools and in public places have stimulated strong interest in policies that might control these outrages. The numbers involved are severe. According to the Pew Foundation, in 2017, almost 40,000 gun-related deaths were recorded in the United States, the highest in recent years. A small arms survey referenced in the Bloomberg Business Week magazine cites 120 guns in the United States for every 100 citizens. With a national population of about 340 million people, that's a heck of a lot of guns in circulation. According to the FBI, the U.S. rate of murder or other manslaughter is the highest in the developed world. In 2016, the United States experienced 64% of its homicides by gun, compared with 30.5% in Canada, 13% in Australia, and 4.5% in England and Wales. Compared to 22 other high-income nations, the United States gun-related murder rate is 25 times higher. The Pew Foundation cites 90 mass shootings in the United States since 1982. But the overall number of people killed in mass shootings is a tiny percentage of the total. For example, in 2016, there were almost 23,000 suicides by guns, 14,415 homicides, and only 71 deaths by mass shootings. Now, of course, to that you can add 2017, 2018. And yet, The overall trend has been for less gun control since 2000. According to a Gallup poll, the significant majority of American population oppose handgun regulation. Handgun bans. Congress has prohibited the Centers for Disease Control from conducting research that advocates in favor of gun control. The CDC has interpreted this ban to extend to all research on gun violence and prevention. And so it has not funded any research on the subject since 1996. But the majority of Americans are dissatisfied with gun laws and policies, and most want stricter regulation. Across the political divide, right and left, most people want a reduction of sales to the mentally ill and to those on watch lists. That's the no-fly stuff and terrorism and what have you. There is also a division over which policy should prevail, such as those relating to the right to carry concealed weapons. So what to do? And to do about what? Tonight, our speakers will address a portion of these issues, providing you with some current information on the topic. Whether you are for or against certain gun control policies, the Network for Responsible Public Policy encourages you to write your congressmen and senators and the federal executive branch to make your opinion known. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. So our first speaker is the wonderful Brett Sabo. She is the New Jersey chapter leader for Moms Demand Action, and prior to this role, she served as the state legislative lead for 2 years. Moms Demand Action has 15 groups in New Jersey that lobby and testify on behalf of gun violence prevention legislation. Our second speaker will be Professor Perry Dane. Now, Professor Perry Dane, some of you might recall, is not new to NFRPP. He's participated in prior program on the Supreme Court. Perry is a professor of law at Rutgers Law School. He was previously on the faculty of the Yale Law School and clerked for Associate Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. His research and teaching includes constitutional law. Dr. Jonelle Bailey, who will be our third speaker, is a resident in general surgery at Rutgers University Medical School and is currently completing her master's in public health with a biostatistics concentration on violence prevention. She is heavily involved in gun violence research. Jonelle attended Jefferson Medical College of Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, was a paramedic in Yonkers and Mount Vernon, New York, which sparked her interest in community medicine and violence prevention. She also has a Bachelor of Science degree in civil engineering from Northeastern University. Our fourth speaker is our Assemblywoman Holly Schepisi. Assemblywoman Schepisi is a Republican who has been representing District 39 for 11 years. She's also a lawyer and businesswoman and worked as a public defender and prosecutor. She currently sits on the following Assembly committees: Education, Health and Senior Services, Housing and Community Development, also Housing Affordability, Economic Justice, and Equal Employment Opportunity, and the New Jersey Legislative Select Oversight. Woo! And finally, our moderator discussant, who will lead a discussion following all the speakers' presentations, and he is Alan Steinberg. And Alan served in the George W. Bush administration for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and is currently widely read as a columnist for Insider New Jersey, a leading digital media source. So we welcome you, and we thank you all for participating. Thank you. So, Brett, we'll start with you.
Good evening, everybody. Oops. play Minecraft by accident? Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Rhoda, for inviting me here tonight. Thank you to my fellow moms for showing up for support. It's always nice to see the red shirts. My name is Brett Sabo. I'm the New Jersey chapter lead for Moms Demand Action. I've been chapter lead for about 2 years, and it's been my greatest honor. I started with Moms Demand Action in 2014. Richard Martinez's son, Christopher, was killed in the Isla Vista shooting in California. And hours later, he went before the TV cameras and he exclaimed, "Not one more. Not one more parent should lose a child. Not one more child should lose a parent or a teacher or any member of their family or friends." And for some reason, that was my call to action. It literally just made me get up off the couch and find where my local group was and deliver my first set of postcards. And from then, I was all in. I'm here tonight to give you a kind of timeline, just very factually based, about the NRA, its origin, how it came to be and why it's changed, and also to talk about the origin of Moms Demand Action and how it came to be. And yeah, and that's why I'm here. I was talking to my Uncle Lee over the holiday, and he lived in Washington, D.C. for a good part of the 80s. And he was telling me that during that time, he belonged to a rifle and gun club in Virginia. And he loved going there. He was a single guy, and he would go, and there were families, and it was all very cordial, and it was very, very nice, and they all kind of adopted him as the single guy from D.C., and he remembers being there and enjoying his time there so much. And after a couple of years there, he remembered that he realized that the radio was on all the time in the background. And it had it always had kind of a right-wing talk radio on in the back. And he remembered Oliver North being on the radio a lot and saying things like, it's better to be in front of a jury of 12 than carried by 6, or things like that, and very, very radical ideas coming to this very friendly, family-friendly group of people. And that so kind of tied in where that change in the NRA happened for me and kind of gave me a really strong visual about that. So going backwards from there, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, was started in 1871 by the National Guard and retired Army vets, and it was originally meant to be a marksmanship club because some of these retired Army vets complained that the Union didn't shoot very well during the Civil War, and he wanted to improve that. Their goals were marksmanship, hunting, and conservation. There was really no mention of the Second Amendment early on of the NRA, and that change didn't really come in until almost 100 years after their existence in the 1960s. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., of Bobby Kennedy, and of John F. Kennedy started to politicize guns and gun violence. The creation of the Saturday Night Special, which became a very cheap and easy way to kind of make your own gun and get your own gun, also made the topic more politically charged. And because of that, within the NRA, kind of a grassroots fringe started to develop within the association. The first piece of gun control legislation since the New Deal was the Gun Control Act of 1968, which got support from even people like Ronald Reagan, who feared groups like the Black Panthers, who were so heavily armed because of these Saturday night specials. So Republicans were really behind this act. In 1972, the ATF was created to monitor firearms, among other things, and that kind of oversight added more fuel for this growing grassroots fringe. And then we get to Mr. Neil Knox, who was 30 years old when he started Gun Week magazine. and he was a member of the NRA, and he's really the one that started the conversation about rolling back gun laws and how restrictive they were becoming. And this group was really growing so much and putting so much pressure on what they called the old guard, that the old guard was really trying to decide, you know, it's getting so political, and we're really not a political group. Like, should we stay in the DC area, or maybe we should just go to Colorado and build this great recreational facility, and we'll all just go and we'll shoot and we'll have fun, and that's what they were meant to be. And they were really gonna go off to Colorado. And what happened was, at their yearly conference in Cincinnati in 1977, the NRA now calls it the Cincinnati Revolt, or the Cincinnati Revolution. What happened was this grassroots fringe held what's basically a coup on the conference floor, and because of the bylaws of the NRA, members can propose any kind of changes that they want to the organization on the floor of the conference. And that's exactly what they did. They held them there all night long till 3:30 in the morning. They proposed 15 changes to the bylaws, and one of the changes was that the membership should be able to choose the executive vice president of the NRA. And by the end of the night, there was a new vice president, and his name was Harlan Carter. He was the founder of the NRA's lobbying unit. He wrote articles that had such divisive phrases as no compromise, no gun legislation. And he also happened to be convicted of shooting a minor when he was 17, but it was later overturned. So that was the new NRA, and that was the new leadership. And that's also when lobbying kind of became involved with the organization itself. So the NRA continued to grow pretty rapidly, but would struggle, ironically, after the Firearms Protection Act of 1968 would actually made it more difficult to sell guns in between states, but because of a last-minute amendment, also tightened laws about machine guns, and the NRA did not like that, and that kind of upset them more, and the more gun laws that were passed, the more upset the NRA became, and the further to the right they get pushed and pushed. And it went the opposite way too. After the Brady Bill was passed in 1981, which strengthened gun laws, that also grew their membership, pushed them more to the right. So it's a very interesting group that grows when things go their way. They get angrier. Nothing grows and strengthens the NRA more than gun control laws and gun violence. And no one took advantage of that more than Wayne LaPierre, who became their head lobbyist, and right around the time that the assault weapons ban was instated. We start to really see the gun lobby and the leadership fighting for their own pocketbook and not for their members and not for gun safety around this time. In 2008, there was the Supreme Court decision of DC versus Heller, which passed 5-4 and said that the Second Amendment ensures an individual's right to own a gun in their home for self-defense. It is not unlimited. It does not ensure that you can carry it anywhere at any time. But that was a very big decision for the NRA and for gun rights, and also kind of tied the Second Amendment to the gun issue. Like I said, the Second Amendment was not always tied to gun laws and to gun violence. It kind of became that way as a way to amp up fear and amp up anger and kind of conflate patriotism with freedom, you know, by coming up with statements such as, you know, NRA is freedom's safest place, and kind of stealing the "don't tread on me" logo and phrase as if that was meant about gun rights and not to represent America during the American Revolution. And then Sandy Hook happened in 2012. And the two things that you can guarantee that will happen after every mass shooting is that people will offer their thoughts and prayers, and people will buy more guns. But after the shooting in 2012, something else happened, and Shannon Watts started a Facebook group page. And that's when Moms Demand Action started, and that was the difference with Sandy Hook. I'm going to tell you that Moms Demand Action was kind of structured after Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Shannon Watts said there has to be a Mothers Against Drunk Driving for gun violence. And she literally called Mothers Against Drunk Driving and said, how do I do this for gun violence? And she actually now has the person that used to run Mothers Against Drunk Driving running Moms Demand Action right by her side. We have a chapter in every state. We have about 4 million members. We have about 10,000 members in New Jersey right here. We are a nonpartisan group that is made up of mothers and others. We have Republicans and Democrats and gun owners and law enforcement and veterans, and we take everybody who thinks that more could be done to reduce gun violence in the country. We are not anti-gun. We are not anti-gunners. We are not, my favorite is libtards, I believe was the quote that I get a lot. What we do is we take different pronged approach to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. We have our Be Smart program, which talks about safe storage, about knowing the danger signs of suicide, so you can make sure children you're around or people are around don't have access to a gun. We fight for good legislation in different states, like we've passed background check bills in 8 different states, which makes our total 20 states in the country where you have to have a background check bill for every single gun that you buy. New Jersey just included that a couple of months ago in the 6-gun bill package that the governor signed. And we fight for bad bills. This year alone, I believe we have defeated guns on campus bills in 13 different states. We rally around candidates who will vote for common sense gun legislation. And during these past midterms, we have our gun sense candidates who've shown to be shown to be politicians that vote using their gun sense, using their common sense when bills are put in front of them. America elected 1,000 gun sense candidates this past midterm, and we unseated 15 A-rated NRA politicians. We're really proud of that. And we're also incredibly proud, out of the tragedy of Parkland, to have started Students Demand Action. We have some students here from Students Demand Action. We have over 200 of these groups throughout the country, and they are doing an incredible job. And as moms, we are there to support them, not do it for them. So we are here for them, to back them up. While the NRA seeks to divide a lot of the time, Moms really seeks to unite. We work in a bipartisan way. The longer we exist, the more bipartisan we become. Seems to be the opposite for the NRA. The longer they exist, the less partisan, the more clustered and they become. For the first time in its existence, the NRA is losing membership. They are losing money. Gun sales are down for the first time because they have a friend in the White House, and when that happens, they push accessories. They've been pushing bump stocks until they actually got banned. They've been pushing to deregulate silencers for the first time in 80 years with what they call the Hearing Protection Act. That hasn't really gone anywhere yet. And despite what you hear in the ads, the vast majority of NRA members believe in common sense gun laws. This is not a radical thing, that there is a distinction, a great distinction between the NRA leadership and the gun lobby and the everyday NRA member. There are 2 very different things. And I think they know this because the cost is too high. There are 4 million kids last year that went through lockdown drills. That is an incredibly traumatic thing that after Parkland, I know they had a fire drill at that school earlier that day. Then they had a second fire drill, and that was actually the false alarm that brought people out into the hallway. And now there are so many kids that every time a fire alarm comes off, even that is traumatizing to kids now. Gun suicides in kids and teens are up 76% since 2008. And our gun homicide rate is 25 times higher than other developed countries. Not because Americans are more violent or we watch more video games. It's about messaging. It's about access. It's about proliferation. It's this false culture that the gun lobby and the leadership, not the membership, has created to get rich. We are the strongest counterweight the NRA has seen, and our successes make us stronger because we realize America cannot afford the price of 40,000 lives a year. And despite what you hear in the ads, like I said, the vast majority of NRA members are with us, and we're very glad that you guys are with us too. So thank you so much for listening. Thanks.
So good evening. Good evening. Let me just put this on. Oops. Okay, just hold on a second. Oh, there we go. Okay, so you see that? Gun violence, myths, realities, and solutions. So my name is Perry Dane, and I'm here to give you something of a legal overview of the questions related to gun control. And the title of the talk is Difficult Words, which is a bit of a pun, because on the one hand, it's the difficulty of reading the primary constitutional text that we have about guns, which is the Second Amendment. So it's just the difficulty of understanding those words, but it's also the difficulty of thinking about the fact that those words are in the Constitution and the implications of that. And just a disclaimer, I have no personal sympathy for guns. If I were writing the Bill of Rights, the last thing that I would think of including would be a text like the Second Amendment. But there it is, And what I want to talk about a little bit about are the implications of having those words in the Constitution and the difficulty of reading them in the first place. And as Brett has already said, this is an incredibly divisive issue. And it's divisive not only on its own merits, but it's divisive because it's become part of this terrible tribalism that we've been living with for the past few years. Now, in fact, one of the subjects I teach is American Indian law. Real tribes are not anything like this, so we need to come up with a better word. But for the time being, the word we have is tribalism. And what that means, right, what that means is that people's views about specific questions, such as the Second Amendment or gun control, become part of a larger package. So people, not everyone, but lots of people who've divided into these tribes, tend to see everything through the prism of their loyalty to the tribe, which makes it much harder to think rationally about the specific question. So you get confrontations like this one. What does it mean to keep America armed? I'm not even sure what that means. But in any event, you have people who are simply screaming at each other rather than talking with each other. So, difficult words. Here's the difficult words that the Constitution gives us. a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And as I said, if I were writing the Bill of Rights, I don't think I'd include language like this, but it's there. So what does it mean? And what did the Supreme Court decide in that Heller decision that Brett was talking about in 2008? Well, it's not obvious. It's not obvious. These words are harder than you might imagine. So just to sort of give you a little taste of the difficulty of reading language. Here's a book from the year 1900. I happen to own this book. It's called The Right to Bear Arms. What do you suppose this book is about? Anyone? Right, meaning? Second Amendment? Hunting? Any other thoughts? Right, carrying a gun. Would it help if I said that this book is actually not by an American author, it's by an English author? Would that change anything? I'm sorry?
He was anti-gun, but he was for guns, but he was anti.
Right. Did somebody say coat of arms? Absolutely. This book has nothing to do with guns. Right? So one of the questions, right? So one of the questions that I ask my constitutional law class is, how do we know that the Second Amendment is about guns at all? How do we know that it's not about the coats of arms? That's what this book was about. This guy was obsessed with the fact that lots of people were claiming the right to use coats of arms in their stationery, in their advertising, when in fact they weren't authorized to do so. There's an ancient set of legal principles about who's actually entitled to use a coat of arms and how you get entitled, and he wanted to make it clear that there were lots of people who were claiming the right to bear arms, meaning the right to use a coat of arms, who actually didn't have that right. You might think that this is an arcane and ancient question, but in fact, he went through the entire history down to the present time, and the last chapter of the book was called Popular Fallacies. So he was really trying to make this a contemporary question. And there was somebody who wrote a book with the contrary view. And in fact, this is still a burning question. Donald Trump, this is before he became president, tried to get authority from the College of Arms, which is the official body in England that gives people the right to bear arms. So he tried to get authority from the College of Arms to use a particular design for his coat of arms. And they denied him that authority because, in fact, the design that he submitted was plagiarized. So there was an old family set of coats of arms that's on the left, and he simply replaced the banner at the bottom with Trump. So if you notice, the coats of arms that he actually uses at his golf course are not the same as the ones that he originally submitted. Okay, but back to the serious question. What do these words mean? And here's sort of the three things that I want to talk about. I want to talk mostly about just the difficulty of reading these words. Then I want to just talk briefly about something that's going to make one side unhappy, which is that if we have a set of rights in the Constitution, we have to recognize that rights do come with costs, not just the Second Amendment, but all rights. And then I'm going to say something that's going to make the other side unhappy, which is, again, very much a point that Brett was emphasizing, that all the rights we have are, in fact, limited. So if there are people on both sides, I hope to make both of you, if not equally unhappy, at least both of you unhappy to some extent. So let's begin with this question of reading a hard text, just sort of reading the words. What do these words mean? And the challenge that the Supreme Court had in 2008 was deciding between two very different interpretations of the Second Amendment. One interpretation said it was a constitutional right for individuals to own guns. The other interpretation was that it had nothing to do with individuals, that it was simply a collective guarantee that state militias could not be banned by the federal government. So it was a states' rights sorts of question, and it had to do with state militias and not with individual gun owners. And here's the problem with the language. So you have an opening clause, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma. And then there's something that some lawyers have called the operative clause, the clause that actually tells you the right that's involved. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So that's the Second Amendment. And there's a common assumption that that first part of the Second Amendment points clearly towards a collective right, that it clearly points towards an interpretation that focuses on the rights of militias, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary, right? The right of the people to keep and bear arms, right? So there are lots of folks who think that the court was just obviously wrong in 2008 when it interpreted the Second Amendment as an individual right. And to be honest, I think the court probably was wrong in 2008. At least that's my bias. But it's a hard question. It's a genuinely hard question. It's much harder than people on both sides might be willing to admit. So what makes it hard? One of the things that makes it hard is that the Second Amendment is written with a grammatical form that is simply unfamiliar to us, that we don't use anymore, right? A well-regulated, so how many times do you say sentences that take that sort of structural form? A blah, blah, blah being necessary, the right of the people to such and such shall not be infringed, right? Does that sort of roll off your tongue, right? It doesn't. In the late 18th century, it did. Right? So they were using a grammatical form that we can't read easily anymore. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that even in the 18th century, this was a grammatical form that served many purposes. Our language, in all sorts of ways, is often ambiguous. And our grammar is often ambiguous, and the meaning of individual words is often ambiguous. And this particular grammatical form in the late 18th century could be used in very different ways. So there are some sources that say there are 6 or 7 possible meanings of not the individual words, but 6 or 7 possible meanings of the grammar of the Second Amendment. So I'm just going to focus on 2. So the language, again, is a well-regulated militia being necessary to secure the free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And one translation of that into a grammar that we would understand is, on account of a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, meaning the right of the people to keep and bear arms is for the sake of the well-regulated militia. So that's a collective right. But there's another interpretation that grammatically in the late 18th century would have made just as much sense. And that is that the first part of the Second Amendment didn't limit the second part. It simply explained the reason for it. It didn't limit it, it simply explained it. So because a well-regulated militia is necessary to security of a free state, therefore, people have to have the right to keep and bear arms. And that has some relationship to the militia, but not a one-to-one relationship, which would make it an individual right. This sort of grammatical ambiguity is common today, not with this sort of sentence structure, but it's common today as well. So here are two sentences. How many students got good grades in the first sentence? Yeah, every single one, right? Because all the students did very well on the exam, and they all got good grades. How many, in the second sentence, how many students got good grades? Right, just a few of them. And the only way we know the difference, is because of the commas. By the way, in the late 18th century, they threw commas around like confetti, so you can't really tell much. But the commas tell the difference. If somebody is just sloppy and leaves out a comma, the whole thing changes. And sometimes commas don't help. This is based on a real sign that I saw in a local shopping center. All right? Who gets to park in that parking lot? All right. So there are two possibilities, right? I mean, you can see what's going on. There are two possibilities. One possibility is that they're just sort of bending over, they're sort of being nice to all their customers, and they call them all valued, right? So the word valued doesn't restrict the word customers. It simply describes it. All our customers are valued, and all of them get to park here, right? The other possibility is that it's only the customers that we think are valued who get to park here, and there's no way to tell the difference unless you know something of the context, or unless you try to park and see if somebody stops you, right? And what I noticed is they had to sign up for a few days, then they took it down, right? Because clearly what they meant is everyone gets to park in this parking lot, but they didn't realize how confusing it was. Okay, so if the language is ambiguous, how do you know what the real answer is? I'm not going to go through the history because the history itself is confusing. The English Bill of Rights included a clause about the right to bear arms, but it was a right to bear arms as regulated by law, and the English regulated guns and still regulate guns enormously. State constitutional provisions, some of them focused on the militia, like Virginia. Some of them had some of each. So in Pennsylvania, this is in 1776, the people have the right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. Right? So if you think that some of these state provisions were the inspiration for the Second Amendment, some of them focused on militias, some of them focused on both, and some of them seem to be very individually based. So this is Kentucky in 1792. All men are by nature free and equal, and the right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state shall not be questioned. But for better or worse, in 2008, the Supreme Court decided the question, and they said it was, in fact, an individual right. But what does that mean? So here's why I want to just briefly make both sides unhappy. For people who say, but the Second Amendment is just too costly. And again, personally, that's where my sympathy is, right? All of those thousands of people who are murdered, all those mass shootings, it's a very expensive right to guarantee. Although in some ways it's more complicated because there are some countries that have far fewer gun deaths because they have far fewer guns. There are some countries like Switzerland that have tons of guns, and they also have far fewer gun deaths. So there's some complicated thing going on that's totally above my pay grade about how the number of guns and the regulation of guns relates to crime. There's some relationship, but it's a complicated one. But in any event, what people who want to regulate guns have to realize is that there are always costs to our rights. And for better or worse, the Second Amendment is there in the Constitution. There are costs to free speech. We all love free speech, but it has real costs. Hate speech kills people. Not directly, but it kills people. Pornography degrades the culture. Fake news damages our politics. The sort of language that we hear in political debate is not good for us in many ways. And yet we think that having the principle of free speech makes these costs, or at least it's not what we think, it's what the Constitution has told us, that having this principle of free speech is worth the cost that we pay. Or think about search and seizure, right? All these people getting off on technicalities because evidence is excluded that was illegally obtained. If you don't see the cartoon, it says, this is a guy trying to get into heaven, and it says, I don't care that your conviction was overturned. Up here, we don't follow the exclusionary rule, but American courts do, which is how at least a fair number of people get acquitted who have been guilty of terrible, terrible crimes. That's a cost we pay. So for people who are really gung-ho about regulating guns and just ignoring the Second Amendment, you have to realize the rights we have, for better or worse, including the rights we don't like, have costs. For people on the other side who say the Second Amendment says the right to keep and bear arms, and therefore no regulation is constitutional, and we have to, quote, protect the Second Amendment, whatever that means, what they have to realize is that just like all our rights have costs, all our rights also have limitations. We do limit free speech. We do limit freedom of religion. We do put constraints around people's privacy. We limit the right to marry. Now, some limits turn out to be unconstitutional, like the ban on same-sex marriage. Other limits are perfectly constitutional. In many states, you can't marry your first cousin. The right to abortion is a constitutional right, but it's not absolute. The rights of parents is a constitutionally protected right, but it's not absolute. We put limits on rights, and then the question is, what's the nature of those limits? Rights can be limited in all sorts of ways. They can be limited by defining them narrowly. They can be limited by having some sort of reasonableness test, or they can be limited by creating exceptions. And we do all of that when we limit our constitutional rights in various ways. And everyone recognizes, even the people who claim they want no restrictions on guns, recognize that certain restrictions are perfectly appropriate, right? We don't allow bazookas, right? And I've heard very few people who want to change that. We don't allow machine guns, genuine machine guns. We don't allow babies to own guns, right? Let alone handle them. And we recognize that you can't get on a plane, or you shouldn't be allowed to get on a plane with a gun, right? So those are all restrictions that have a fair amount of consensus behind them. So the real debate is not about whether there should be restrictions at all. The real debate is about what the nature of those restrictions should be. And that's not something that I want to talk about tonight. That's for other people to talk about. What I will say is that what we can hope for is that in debating these questions, we move away from tribalism and polarization and invective, and we move toward this sort of more reasonable discussion that I think we're hoping for tonight. So thank you.
All right, I'm Janelle Bailey. I'm going to talk about how gun violence pertains to health. I want to make a little disclaimer. So I am not going to talk about specific things that I see. I'm not going to talk about what the worst thing is I've ever seen. And there's no photos that are terrible in this presentation. So I'm going to go over these things that I'm showing you. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to reiterate some of the statistics that other people have already talked about. I'll talk about the groups that are disproportionately affected by gun violence, and then we'll talk about gun violence and looking at it from a public health perspective. And I'll talk about some things that we can do as individuals and as a group here in this room today. So I have some statistics from the CDC from 2017. Other people have said that there were nearly 40,000 gun deaths in 2017, which was actually a record high for gun-related deaths in the US in the 4 decades prior. So since the CDC even started having a code for mortality by firearm in their data set. So that was in 1979. The actual number was 39,773. 2017 was also the deadliest for mass shootings. So that was following the Las Vegas concert shooting and the Sutherland Springs church shooting in Texas. And I think it's important to note that we say all these numbers and we look at statistics, but that's more than 100 people per day across the country that die by firearm. More than 116,000 people are shot and don't die, and that's probably a number that's underreported. There's actually no reporting system across the country for non-fatal injuries. Many patients don't self-report, and a lot of them don't even go to the hospital for care for their injuries. 17% of all injury deaths are by firearm, and that's, like I said, it was the worst year in 2017. It was a 6% increase from the year prior. If you look at the breakdown of firearm fatalities, it's almost 2/3 that are suicides, and I think that that's an interesting fact to note because there's a lot of misconception about what the actual breakdown is of firearm deaths. So nearly 2/3 are suicides and about 1/3 are homicides, and then the rest is a very small number compared to the larger numbers, but it's unintentional deaths, shootings by law enforcement, which sort of can be grouped into unintentional, and then accidental or undetermined. If we look specifically at suicide, as I said, that's 2/3 of all gun deaths, but half of all suicides that are successful suicides are firearm suicides. 85% of people that attempt suicide by gun are successful. And if you compare that to the number of other people that attempt suicide by all other means, only 5% of those people are successful. In the US, the gun suicide rate is 8 times that of other high-income countries. If we look at the next highest country, the rate is more than twice that. So the next highest country is Finland, and the rate is 3.3 per 100,000 people, whereas in the US it's 6.3. So this is despite having an average total suicide rate compared to other high-income nations. Just our gun suicide rate is much higher. The access to a gun increases the risk of death by 3 times, and gun suicides are concentrated in states with high gun ownership. When I start talking about which groups are affected, this is one of the groups that's significantly affected by gun suicide is white men. Those are 3/4 of all firearm suicide victims. So on to homicide. So there was, again, a brief mention about the US versus other high-income countries. You can see just by this graphic that the US is out there compared to these other countries. Homicide is 1/3 of gun deaths, and we have the highest firearm homicide rate, and obviously Canada's second there. It's 10 times higher than averaged among all the other countries. Access to a gun doubles the risk of death by homicide when you're looking at the method of homicides. And gun homicides are concentrated in cities, so out of all the cities in the US, half of these homicides take place in about 127 cities, which represents 1/4 of the US population. The gun homicides are most prevalent in racially segregated high-poverty neighborhoods, and this is probably not information that's new to people, or that this is going to mostly just be a different way of looking at things. Firearms obviously affect children and teens as well, so it's notable that every day 47 children and teens are shot across the country. 8 of these children die, and 39 are injured and survive. Out of the 8 that die, 4 of them are murdered, 3 commit suicide, and 1 is an accidental death. Out of the 39 that are injured, 31 are injured in an attack like an assault. 1 survives a suicide attempt, and 7 are accidentally shot. For children that are less than 13 years old, these types of injuries most frequently occur in the home and are most frequently due to family violence. It's the number 2 leading cause of death in America. Intimate partner violence is 15% of all violent crime across the country, and in terms of domestic violence, women aged 18 to 24 are most commonly abused. Nearly 500 women a year are killed by their partner. The lifetime prevalence of domestic violence is between 30 and 60%. There's a lot of literature out there and a lot of different surveys that look at the prevalence of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So that's why there's such a broad range of percentiles. But across all those studies and all those surveys, the prevalence is higher in women and higher in the LGBTQ groups. The presence of a gun around the partner or in the home increases the risk of homicide by 500%. America has a much higher domestic violence problem than these other countries around the world. So I've talked about a lot of death. For me, what I see mostly in the hospital is non-fatal gun injuries, and so I want to spend some time talking about that. 3/4 of non-fatal gun injuries are caused by assault, and you can see the breakdown of the others in this graphic. Because of spinal damage, my patients become paralyzed, unable to walk, and sometimes unable to move anything from the neck down. Because of blood loss and infections, they have their leg bones removed and undergo limb amputations. Because of intestinal perforations, they wear colostomy bags to reroute feces to a bag over their skin. Many require multiple surgeries, followed by a lifetime of hospitalizations from antibiotic-resistant infections and chronic unremitting pain. Some become addicted to painkillers. They face a downward spiral of unemployment and poverty, homelessness, and hopelessness. That's an excerpt from Dr. Wen from this article from the New York Times, What Bullets Do to Bodies. And I think it's an interesting perspective to hear from healthcare, from anybody that works in healthcare, because we don't necessarily think of firearm injuries as something that's lasting. It's an incident like any other incident, like a car accident. But unfortunately, that's not true for a lot of patients, and they have a lifetime of change and a lifetime of effects from their firearm injury. So I said I would talk about who gun violence affects. So I pretty much summarized most of these facts that are listed, but white men are almost 3/4 of firearm suicide victims. And I talked about the 50% of gun homicides that take place in a small number of cities that represent 25% of the US population in these racially segregated high poverty neighborhoods. Black Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die by gun homicide, and black men are 16 times more likely to be injured in assault by gunfire than white men. For children and teens, firearms are the second leading cause of death. I feel like I can't emphasize that enough. Children shouldn't die, and the fact that firearms, which is something that's preventable for their death, is the second leading cause of children's deaths in America is crazy. And for black children and teens, is the first leading cause of death. Black children and teens are 14 times more likely than white children and teens of the same age to die by gun homicide, and that is 14 times is such a ridiculous statistic, and I think we really need to make some changes with this, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And again, women are at risk, young women that are the most frequent victims of intimate partner violence. So there's other people that are affected by gun violence that we don't talk about a lot. At the end of an inconspicuous hallway and a strategically placed, there's a room far away from the controlled chaos of the trauma bay. It's a dimly lit waiting area that we in the medical field call the quiet room. It's a bland spot with a few soft chairs surrounding a table that holds a box of crisp institutional tissues. There may be a picture or two on the wall, but generally it's an unassuming room where physicians tell mothers about the deaths of their children, far too often because of firearm violence. As we make our way to this room, we recite a careful script. We use words intended to ease this painful first and only meeting. The reality is that over the years, we found that there is no good way to tell a mother that her child has died, especially when the unexpected death might have been avoidable. We introduce ourselves as the doctor who took care of their child. We take a deep breath, we look into their eyes, and quickly break the devastating news. There's no reason to delay. What follows is the visceral, piercing shriek of a mother's wailing. We often weep with these mothers. We sometimes quietly blame ourselves for not being able to do more to save their baby's life. And when they're done, as is often the case, we hold them up while they cry. The room in this picture is the quiet room at University Hospital in Newark. What I just read is a quote from this perspective piece in the New England Journal of Medicine. So it's not just the people that are victims, the people that are shot. It's not just the families that are shot. Sorry, it's also the people that take care of them, and I see it every single call. So every time I take a trauma call, Even on a cold Tuesday in January, there's still victims of gun violence in my trauma bay. So when we talk about the cost of gun violence, it's not just an economic cost, but the economic cost is significant in America. The total cost of gun violence every year is over $229 billion. That's more than we give for foreign aid. That's more than Apple's annual revenue. That's more than the cost of obesity that's estimated in healthcare in America. And it's nearly as much as Medicaid spending and nearly as much as the cost of smoking. And it's more than $700 per American per year, and it varies by state to as much as double that. As I said, the costs are not necessarily things that we initially think of. So it's not just the ambulance, it's not just the hospitalization or the surgery, it's not just the complications that they have in their first visit. It's their time in the intensive care unit, which can be weeks, months, and sometimes they're in the hospital for even years, depending on what their injuries are. There's also the cost once they leave: physical therapy, rehab, social work, changing their house to accommodate what their injuries are in their lifetime of care, and their follow-up visits, counseling, and then they will inevitably come back with complications. But there's also the things that change in society. So the lost income of the individual or the family that's caring for them, their lost productivity as society, their lost productivity to their family, and sometimes they're caretakers before they're shot, so the people that they were caring for, not just the people that are caring for them. They miss school, and people do try to make changes when they're shot, and sometimes it's difficult because of the cost of relocating to accommodate the injured people or the social situation that ended up with them being shot. So there's all these things that add up to that $229 billion. So what can we do? So besides coming to talks like this and learning about the facts, I'm going to talk about a few things that we can do here. I don't know politics, laws. I spend all my time in the hospital, so I can't talk about those things as what these other people on the panel are for. I literally spend all my life in the hospital. Okay. So the CDC defines an epidemic as the occurrence of more cases of a disease than are expected in a given area or among a specific group of people over a particular period of time. And this obviously applies to gun violence because somehow in America we've gotten used to expecting 100 firearm-related deaths per day. The opioid crisis kills about 170 people per day, and everybody's been up in arms for the last few years about that, and there's been a lot of changes in legislation and lawsuits and all these things filed, and even changes in how physicians prescribe medications and how people have access to pharmacies and databases set up and all these things, and still for firearm violence has been a problem for decades, and there's a lot of this attention is not put towards this. So one of the things that needs to happen is that public health and journalism need to collaborate. So a lot of the reporting on gun violence is skewed. So there are actually guidelines on reporting suicides and mass shootings, and there's a lot of media coverage which is for the shock value because it's all about ratings and commercials and getting people to pay attention to your channel or your newspaper or any of those things. But if the media could come together and actually follow the guidelines on reporting, then it would change what the public sees as the narrative on gun violence. The media should also proactively report successful models for prevention, which I literally have never seen. Not the successful models, but never seen the media reporting on successful models. And also, we should all be aware of prejudices that surround gun violence and need to be confronted. These need to be confronted and eradicated. And what that means specifically is that we think about specifically suicides and homicides, we think about them as isolated incidents. We think about them as bad people making bad choices or people that have problems that don't affect us as individuals or don't affect our own families or neighborhoods. We think of the homicides as gangbangers. We think of them as requiring punishment for their actions and that it's an intractable problem in those communities. What we need to think about is that this is a contagious process like any other disease or any other epidemic. We need disease control, and that we need to recognize that this is a complex issue with many precipitating factors that are mental health, socioeconomic factors, and things that are much too long to list. I could talk about that for an hour. If we look at gun violence as a public health problem, then we have to take a public health approach, and that means that we focus on primary prevention, which honestly in the United States we're not great at, and that's across all types of disease. So primary prevention means that we're going to make an intervention before the health effects occur. So for other things, it's easier to understand the concept of like vaccines or changing risky behaviors, changing eating habits, stopping tobacco use before you develop lung cancer. All those things are primary prevention. As with HIV, influenza, and all the previous epidemics in the United States, gun violence can feel relentless and incurable, but we need to change the narrative around this disease. We have some things in place for secondary prevention. So once people are shot once, we have hospital-based violence intervention programs that address what the precipitating factors were to them being shot. And we try to make an intervention from, it's kind of a wraparound model where we look at their family and social status and what's going on in their neighborhood and what's going on in their life that would have put them in the situation where they're shot. But by then it's already too late because they've been shot. And not everybody even qualifies for those programs. They're grant funded. I'll talk about money shortly. But there's a lot of people that aren't interested or can't make changes that will get them out of situations where they ended up being shot in the first place. And in my opinion, tertiary prevention for gun violence is, we're already way behind the 8 ball. There's now generations of children that have been around so much violence that it's the norm for them. And so until we make some sort of changes, it's going to continue to be the norm. So recently the NRA tweeted this. People that are on Twitter may have seen this or heard about it. It basically sparked a campaign by physicians that this is our lane. That's the hashtag. So if you are interested in seeing pictures of things that are not gory, but like of things that happen in the hospital that are related to gun violence, physicians have been tweeting that with that hashtag from their operating rooms, from their trauma bays, from the emergency rooms, of all the things that they see, not patients, but things that they see and how they're affected. Briefly mentioned was the Dickey Amendment in 1996 and how that changed funding. Basically, it said that none of the funds made available for injury prevention and control at the CDC may be used to advocate for or promote gun control. So $2.5 million was stripped from the CDC budget that year, which was the exact amount that had been previously spent on gun violence research. As recently as the spring of 2016, Congress voted to extend the ban by not appropriating funds for gun violence research to the CDC. However, the NIH can technically still fund gun violence research. If we look at motor vehicle collisions and the reduction in morbidity and mortality with research, there's a million things, right? There's child safety seats, seatbelts, airbags, traffic laws, speed limits. All those interventions were based on data. So in order to make some changes, we're gonna have to have data. The lack of reliable data hinders understanding of the problem. It makes researchers hesitant to enter the field when there's all these barriers to overcome in terms of funding, and it's not as if researchers make a lot of money to begin with. And then few private centers are dedicated to funding gun violence research, and usually private funding is less than public funding. If you look at this graph, this basically shows that publications about gun violence fell after the ban. So it's not just that the CDC cut their funding for research, it's sort of a pattern that was across the US at that time. So that was sort of the final straw, and then people found it difficult to do research, and then therefore it's difficult to publish research. When I said that NIH is technically allowed to fund gun violence research, they are technically allowed to fund gun violence research, but there's only 3 NIH research awards looking at over 4 million injuries from firearms from 1970s to 2012. Whereas if we look at some of the other things that are funded by the NIH, cholera, diphtheria, polio, and rabies, obviously there's many less cases of those diseases in the US, but there were nearly 500 research awards for research on those topics. Gun safety education, I'm going to talk about that in terms of from a physician standpoint. So there was a survey about whether it's okay for doctors to ask patients about firearms, and I'm not a primary care physician. I don't see people in the office for their routine checkups, but you know, I did rotations on family medicine and internal medicine, and there's people probably here that work in internal medicine, but you know that in those practices, when you all go to the doctor, when you go for your checkup or for your annual physical exam, you're asked some questions about screening, and more recently, probably some questions about your mental health, some questions about you know, if you're in a safe situation at home. And so there was a survey that was sent to the public that was whether it's okay for doctors to ask patients about firearms, and you can see that a lot of people feel that it is okay for physicians to ask patients about firearms. But many physicians are actually uncomfortable with these discussions because they are concerned about offending their patients. And for primary care, and even for in-hospital care, it's difficult to form a good relationship with the patient in a way that you know you want them to come back when they don't necessarily need to, so for their follow-up visits or for their checkups when they're feeling fine. So it's definitely a concern for primary care physicians to not make their patients feel uncomfortable. Also, physicians don't have enough expertise in this topic, right? So what do you say when somebody says, I have a firearm in the home and it's not locked? What do? I don't know what the resources are for getting a lock. Or what do I tell them? That that's okay? Is it not okay? Is it based on my own political beliefs? What are their political beliefs? Is it for hunting? Is it for self-defense? Like all those things are, what would we say to them? So it's a good idea in theory, but not necessarily very practical. And then all those people with the dark, that fall into that dark column there, would be the people that were offended if a doctor was to ask them about firearms. And so maybe that would form some animosity in the relationship and prevent the patient from willingly coming back to see the doctor or to talk about things that are maybe other topics that are more sensitive. Other barriers with physicians. There's this docs versus Glocks legislation. So this map is a little bit old, but not super old. Basically in Florida, there's a law that it limits physicians' ability to discuss guns with patients. So doctors are allowed to ask about firearms only when relevant to caring for the patient, which is broad. What does that mean? In Florida, there's a high burden of proof. So I would imagine that unless somebody directly came in and said that they misfired their gun or that they feel like they're gonna commit suicide and they have a firearm in their house, that it's not gonna be a typical screening question that physicians are allowed to ask. Then the other issue is like, who's monitoring this? So who's to say that, like, you can't put the burden on the physician or on the patients to say whether it's an appropriate topic to be discussed, right? So there shouldn't be legislation about what a doctor-patient relationship, what the conversations are in that relationship. And so this, Florida has this law, and there's also other states that are either trying to pass or have similar, but not as strong types of legislation. The problem with this, other than just limiting the patient-doctor relationship, is that counseling of patients about firearm safety has actually been demonstrated to effectively promote gun safety practices. So sometimes I think that like a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think that they need a child safety lock if they don't have a child in the home, but maybe they have little cousins that come over, or maybe they have nieces and nephews, or, so having conversations is important. And then the other thing is that counseling, this type of counseling that I've been discussing is supported by numerous physician groups. So family medicine, peds, all the different specialties that, and obviously surgeons and trauma surgeons, the different groups that are directly affected by this epidemic. So in summary, we need to change our perspectives on the underlying causes of gun violence and recognize this epidemic as a public health crisis. We have to accept that people, specifically physicians and those working in healthcare, can be anti-bullet without being anti-gun. We need to fund research for gun violence, support public funding for firearm violence research. We need to encourage safety education programs, so gun safety for parents has actually been shown to be more effective than gun safety for teens. We need to support discussions with primary practitioners regarding guns in the home. We need to support institutions the institution of safety mechanisms, and specifically having conversations about gun safety, so trigger locks, smart gun technology, child locks, all those things that, again, I'm not an expert on. We have to vote for policy changes or for people that will support policy changes. Child access prevention laws, background checks, and other things that people here are talking about. Also laws, somebody mentioned like limiting laws for, or limiting access for people with mental health issues, but also histories of domestic violence I think is important to mention. And we need to advocate, and I know the people in this room are here because they're advocating, but this is just like any other public health epidemic in America, and it affects everybody, and so it's important for us to advocate as if it affects us on an individual level. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Holly Shapizi, and my speech is going to be more focused on New Jersey, our current laws, my own experiences, and kind of how my own position on guns, gun safety, gun laws have ebbed and flowed as a result of my own experiences. It started in DC, and I know we spoke about DC in the 80s. We spoke about the Heller decision in 2008. Well, on the night before my 21st birthday, back in 1992, I was a victim of an attempted carjacking in my parking lot. And about 4 months prior to that, I had had a sawed-off double-barrel shotgun put to my head in a Pizza Hut on a Sunday afternoon while studying for exams by two kids who came up and held the Pizza Hut up And so I had had two back-to-back experiences of being, a violent crime victim. And in a couple of years prior to that, I had also been a rape victim. So as somebody who had experienced some pretty severe back-to-back traumatic events, I ultimately decided I wanted a gun to protect myself. I came back to New Jersey. I learned how to shoot a gun. I learned gun safety. I took classes. I went to gun ranges and went back to DC to find out that under no circumstance whatsoever, didn't matter what my safety concerns were or anything else, as a private citizen, I could not own a gun under any circumstance. And at the time, Washington, D.C. happened to be the murder capital of the United States. It was at the height of the crack epidemic, and I lived in a really bad section of the city. There was a lot of inner city violence, there was a lot of gang violence, and we became almost anesthetized to it. My very first day of college, a cleaning lady was murdered on the front steps of our dorm in a domestic violence situation. At a party at my friend's house 3 years later, the next door neighbor was murdered in a drug deal gone bad with a bullet that actually came through our wall. So I came from Saddle River, New Jersey, where there was no violence whatsoever, to spending 4 years in probably one of the worst gun violence arenas that somebody could be in. And I felt that the only way to protect myself was to have a gun myself. And, it's what piqued my interest in gun rights as a victim. And so my interest in the Heller case was personal. It was something that I did follow. I moved from DC to London and happened to be there during the height of the IRA bombing. So, it was a couple of good years back to back. But, from there I moved to Manhattan and went to Fordham Law School. And with time, with some therapy, got rid of my post-traumatic stress from having lived in DC and really didn't think about guns all that much for the next decade. I did work at the Manhattan DA's office. I was a bit of the female Forrest Gump in careers. I went from the DA's office to doing death penalty appeals in the South, corporate mergers and acquisitions, was working 80, 90 hours a week, and really didn't think about this issue one way or another. I then moved back to New Jersey, continued to commute to Manhattan. September 11th occurred. We had really big issues from terrorism type of things, but gun violence was not at the forefront, notwithstanding my own experiences in DC, because I thought I had put that behind me and it was no longer impacting me on a day-to-day basis, and for my mental health, I could just move past it. I have two children. I have a 15-year-old daughter and I have a 7-year-old son. And while I was pregnant with my son, I got approached to run for office in New Jersey. And I still blame it on the morphine because in a weak moment, I agreed 2 weeks after having had a C-section and went door to door with a newborn baby in my arms and ran for state assembly as the first thing I had ever run for in my life. And I came into office as a kind of anomaly. I call myself a unicorn. I'm a pro-choice, social libertarian, fiscally conservative Republican woman from Bergen County, New Jersey. There aren't a lot of us out there. And I didn't belong to the NRA. I didn't seek their support when I ran. I literally ran with $10,000 of my own money, and somehow, some way gave birth on July 16th, 2011, and won in November of that year, never having done this. And what happened is we had a couple of back-to-back really awful gun violence situations. I knew nothing about the gun laws in New Jersey, but as a mother of kids, I started researching stuff. And, to my pleasant surprise, New Jersey had very strict gun laws. And I'm somebody who, I didn't understand what the laws were until I started researching them. And I even decided to see how difficult it would be to purchase a gun myself. And I remember going into Ramsey Outdoor Store and asking to see one of the guns up behind the counter. And the guy looked at me like I had 27 heads, and he said, where's your ID? So I take out my driver's license, I hand it to him. He goes, no, where's your firearm ID card? And I said, what? I said, all I want to do is take a look at it. He said, you can't touch it, you can't go near it. Here's the paperwork, go to your local police department. And so I never went through the whole process because I don't want a gun in my own home, particularly with my children. But it was the first time that I understood the various levels that you had to go through in New Jersey in order to get a gun. And so, quite candidly, for my first couple of years in office, I didn't see a pressing need for, major overhauls of our gun laws in New Jersey because they were very strict. And I voted yes on certain measures. I voted no on some that I thought would maybe unfairly target otherwise law-abiding people. I sponsored one bill because of my own experience way back when in DC that would allow people who went through training, who went through background checks, who went through every different conceivable thing in getting a gun, that if they had a legitimate need to carry one, that they'd be able to carry a gun in New Jersey. It was the one and only pro-gun legislation that I had ever sponsored. So fast forward a couple of years, and I had never sought NRA endorsement. I never received a check from them. And in 2015, I happened to miss one legislative voting session that had a bunch of different gun bills on. Everything from, toy guns that look like real guns to a whole host of other things. And I missed that session, and missed it for a legitimate reason. I happened to be in a neuro ICU unit recovering from a brain aneurysm. But as a result of having missed that, I all of a sudden was given an A by the NRA, which thought that I had intentionally not voted on those particular things. So, after Las Vegas, there was a heightened awareness. You had a lot of groups out there that, are understandably very upset by what's going on. And my office started getting picketed. Commercials started running that I was part of a domestic terrorist group. And I was sitting down and explaining to my children that, mommy's not a terrorist, and I have no idea why they're running commercials of, men with machine guns saying that mommy supports that sort of stuff. And, this goes to Perry's point of tribalism. I, up until that point, had thought that I had a pretty reasonable stance on gun laws. I, am absolutely for universal background checks. I am absolutely for keeping guns out of the hands of domestic violence offenders, those with mental illness, keeping guns out of the hands of children, holding people criminally liable for improperly providing guns to any person who shouldn't have them. I sponsored the legislation. I was the original sponsor of the legislation in New Jersey to ban bump stocks. Notwithstanding that, it still became a very polarized, you're a Republican, you are a bad human being, you want kids to have guns, you want teachers in classrooms to have guns, which is the dumbest idea ever. And, it's a function of we stopped talking to one another. And, if we use New Jersey as a template for other states, some statistics just talking straight New Jersey, because I don't think a lot of people understand, what the current statistics in New Jersey are. 2017, How many homicides do you think took place in Bergen County? Anyone? 4. Out of those 4 homicides, 3 were domestic violence. 1 was 2 residents of a building who got into a stabbing fight. Out of the domestic violence, 2 were shootings. Homicides in the entire state of New Jersey in 2017-2018 dropped by over 7%. Now, if you look at that, Bergen County has over close to 1 million residents. We are larger than more than 5 states in the District of Columbia, and yet 4 homicides in total in 2017. So our gun laws are obviously working. Out of the gun violence that does take place, that the doctor unfortunately sees in Newark, it's, and we need to work in trying to come up with better solutions. The number of guns that were used in crimes in New Jersey, almost all of them are coming from outside of New Jersey and from other states. In fact, in 2016, and we had a marked reduction in gun violence in 2017 and 2018. In 2016, there were 2,477 crimes in New Jersey with guns. 79% of those guns came from other states. Only 21% of the guns were even purchased in New Jersey. And a majority of the guns used were illegal in every different capacity. So it's something whereby, I'm part of now a bipartisan women's caucus. I'm the co-chair of it for the legislature. We've had discussions about doing bipartisan letters and bipartisan press releases and calls for other states and the federal government to start implementing some of the reasonable restrictions that New Jersey has put forth. And if you want to see real progress, New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the nation. We have, a lot of issues in this state. Gun violence, believe it or not, we fall into, I think, out of the 50 states, we range between 46th and 49th, depending on the year, for gun violence. We also have, at this point, I think, the strictest gun laws in the country. But there is more that we all need to do together. And just to put it into context, and we talked about overdoses a little bit, New Jersey does have an awful overdose problem. In comparison, we had 3,137 overdose deaths in 2018. It's larger than the entire borough of Saddle River, the entire student population of St. Peter's University in Jersey City. And it now is more than all the deaths of flu, Alzheimer's, breast cancer, colon cancer, cervical cancer, prostate cancer, homicide, suicide, and car accidents combined in the state of New Jersey. So, I mean, those numbers are staggering. With respect to what can we do collectively and what can we do nationally? Many of these suggestions have already been put forth, and it's stuff that we need to, first we need to work on bipartisan solutions because, absent eliminating the Second Amendment, which, I know some people in this room would advocate for, but I think pragmatically we realize that's not going to occur. So we need to work in a bipartisan way to come up with reasonable solutions. And towards that, we do need to stop demonizing one another on this issue. It's important enough for our children, our grandchildren. We need to be able to have open, honest conversation about it and agree to disagree on certain things. Poverty, gang violence. When you talk about honesty of media, a school shooting will be worldwide. It's an awful thing. As a mother, I don't know if I'd be able to ever get out of my bed again if it was my child. But yet, in every inner city, that's one weekend of violence. And the number of people who die on a week-by-week basis in inner cities, and it doesn't even merit, a front page. So we do have to have more open and honest dialogue about how we combat that. Because even in New Jersey, with the strictest gun laws in the country, we're still having large numbers of young black men in Rutgers, Newark Hospital with gunshots every single weekend. And, we can pass every law we know. We've got to address the underlying root of those issues. And that's why funding gun violence studies and initiatives and providing more funding to the NIH is really important. We keep funding like drunk monkey studies, and we're not funding, gun violence studies, and it makes no sense. Domestic violence is a huge issue. And, both suicides as well as homicides oftentimes are coming out of domestic violence situations, not just for the women, but for the children as well. And if you look to a lot of the statistics on children who commit suicide with guns, there's generally substance abuse, domestic violence, and a whole host of other issues in those households that we need to really enact much stricter laws across the United States to ensure that domestic violence, anybody who's involved in domestic violence is not being issued weapons. And access of children to guns, incredibly important. We have laws in New Jersey, but yet we oftentimes hear, whenever we do hear of a mass shooting, about these kids getting the guns from their parents. If you as a parent are allowing your child, who has every obvious signal to have a weapon that they're going to use to inflict this sort of carnage, you need to be held personally responsible. And so that's something that I feel very strongly about as well. Background checks, gun safety education, these are all things that we need to work on in a bipartisan fashion to be able to get states outside of New Jersey to start buying into it. We also need to provide, and my husband and I have spoken about this, maybe an alternate source of funding for people who may have taken donations from the NRA in the past, who felt that they needed it in order to win an election or a primary. Maybe put together some means of, if you take a pledge, you will support changes in gun safety, changes to gun policy, that here's a PAC or something that will help support you, and take people outside of feeling obligated to take that money. I took one check from the NRA in my entire time in office, and it was candidly after the commercials were running that I was part of a domestic terrorist group. And I was pissed. It wasn't who I was. And people were coming at me so hard that it was kind of, well, why shouldn't I take the money if they're already running it, saying all this stuff about me? And then after Parkland, I actually donated the entire check plus 2 times the amount to the Parkland funds, because I didn't feel right having taken the $500 or the $250 or whatever it was that was given to me. And I made a pledge from that point forward never to take any additional money, because I don't want anybody to ever think that I am beholden to an organization for a couple of $100, and that that's going to, in any sort of fashion, shape the way I vote or what I believe on a topic. But I know for a lot of other people out there, they may feel that, if they start to change your view or support some of these initiatives, being in the middle is oftentimes much more difficult than being on either extreme, because when you are in the middle, you get it from both sides. And I think we need to start having discussions on how to protect the people who are willing to come into the middle from being attacked from both sides. But we do have a lot of work to do. New Jersey, I do believe, what's already banned in New Jersey, assault weapon lookalikes, any sort of machine pistols, any sort of bump stocks. You have required background checks for private gun sales. We have banned armor-piercing ammunition. We allow mental health care professionals to initiate seizure of firearms for any patients posing threat to themselves or others. We have protective order for domestic violence victims. We have a whole host of different initiatives, many of which were spoken about today. But even in some of those initiatives that we have passed, quite candidly, we've had concerns come back to us by healthcare professionals, by those in the mental health sectors who have said, we're concerned that some of the bills that you are passing will make it so that those who do need the help will not come to us for fear of mandatory requirements and reporting obligations. So it's always trying to balance some of those concerns with overall safety measures as well. So, if I, as a Republican, have voted yes on all this stuff, there is a lot of room for bipartisan discussion on this. It's just a function of not screaming at each other and talking to one another. So thank you.
If you don't mind, I suffered a leg injury I'm recovering from, so rather than standing up, I'll talk sitting down. I have a rather loud voice, so I think you can all hear me. I just have a humorous observation to make about something my good friend Professor Dane said. He talked about how rights are not absolute, even the right to marry. What? How do I get this on? Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. He talked about how there's even restrictions on the right to marry about first cousins. I knew two first cousins. In 1920, they were very much in love. They were from an Orthodox Polish Jewish family where marrying first cousins was very common. But in Pennsylvania, it was against the law for first cousins to marry. So they went up to Cleveland, Ohio, they got married, and their grandson, Alan Steinberg, was born in 1949. And my great-grandparents were first cousins, too. So sometimes consensus has its limitations. Okay, I'm going to throw out 4 points. I'll just talk briefly on each, because I have to leave at a certain point. But the first point is on the NRA. I think there's a reason the NRA wins a lot of these battles, and sometimes they lose by winning. And that is that they tend to be more politically effective than the opposition to free and unfettered use of guns. I'll give you the best example I can give, and that was in New Jersey when Jim Florio was defeated for re-election. I was on the Republican legislative staff then. As a result of getting more familiar with the NRA, I moved to the left on the whole gun issue, okay? But let me tell you something what they did. It was very clever. They did not, so they talked about how terrible it was that he was banning assault weapons, he was taking away your right to bear arms, and he was not advocating any of these things. In fact, today Jim Florio and I are good friends. But what they did is they ran against him on the tax issue. They did not limit themselves to guns. And what they did is that all of the bumper stickers you saw in 92 and 93 that said Florio free in 93, they had rallies at the State House against the toilet paper tax, because where he really got into trouble wasn't so much in raising income taxes, it was when he spread the taxes around. So the NRA became the warp and woof of the anti-tax movement, and they were defeated. They never got the assault ban rescinded, but they really defeated Jim Florio. And then later on, when the vote came up to rescind the assault weapons ban, the Assembly passed the rescission of that ban. The Senate retreated from that, and they basically voted to keep it. Well, the man who they held responsible, Don DeFrancesco, the Senate president, when he ran for governor in 2001, the NRA really got him. They got all kinds of information on his private life. They used that against them. So these folks are effective. And the first
Well, it's easy
point-
to be
let me
effective
finish.
when you
Let me-
fight
let me-
dirty.
Let me finish, okay? My first point, I'm throwing out 4 points, and then I'll keep quiet. I'll be uncharacteristically brief. The first point is, if you want to win these battles, and I want you to win these battles, you've got to analyze every single place where you're going to have some kind of campaign and find out what the political context is. Otherwise, you can lose them. And that's why the NRA, these guys are clever. They're not the I'm not with them, but they are very shrewd. And every single campaign they get involved in. And New Jersey was the ultimate example of that. They didn't get the assault weapons ban rescinded, but they defeated some very key people. Secondly, is what the professor talked about, the Heller case. I think the Heller case, I like to try to find common ground in politics. And I think the Heller case is a good example of how maybe we can get a consensus on the gun issue. The person who wrote that opinion was not some left-wing fanatic. It was Justice Scalia. The ultimate original understanding and interpretation, strict constructionist justice. He was a person I admired very much. He had basically 5 points. Justice Scalia said, number one, that you could have gun control to limit guns to their intended uses, like hunting and self-defense. You didn't need an assault weapon in a home. You didn't need an atomic bomb in a home. The second point he made was you could limit it to eliminate certain classes, like felons and people who were mentally ill. The third thing he mentioned was that you could limit the ways they were sold. You could require licensing. The fourth thing is that you could basically be against concealment of guns. And he basically affirmed that you did not have an unqualified right to carry a concealed weapon. And the fifth matter was that you couldn't have guns in certain places, like schools and other places. Now, my point is, and Holly spoke very well about that also, is that the Heller case, I think, should be an area where maybe the NRA, look, I know how they are with guns, okay? But maybe there's an area of great commonality where the public can unite on something like the Heller case and have a common agenda. The third point I want to make is the student movement. I was a student during the Vietnam era. You students who are out there tonight, you are the key to limiting gun violence. You can be very effective. The problem is the anti-Vietnam War movement, I think, was more effective than the student movement on guns, because somehow or other, you had a person like Allard Lowenstein back then in the late 60s, early 70s, who was a conventional liberal politician, but he loved the student movement. And somehow, I think the problem you're having, I'm not faulting you, you're the ones that are doing all the good work, but you got to get more students to vote. I'm very disappointed in the voting turnout of young people. It's not enough. During the Vietnam War, we all voted because we were afraid of going to Vietnam. I don't know how you establish this, but you got to get more people out there. And the final thing was something that Joe and Nell said. It was a very moving presentation you gave. I think that's a reason why we need more support for trauma units in urban areas, because the urban areas really have a disproportionate amount of the gun violence. And I think that it may be the reason you have more sensitivity in urban areas is that people, like Holly said, there were like 4 homicides in Bergen County. People aren't living with the day-to-day consequences of gun violence in these suburban areas as much. And so there's a need to get that message across. Those are the 4 points. I've got to leave around 9:35 to catch a train. So I'll throw these out to you to comment. Holly? You have any questions? I didn't even answer about my late grandparents. Yes, sir.
If you have to leave that one, you can't, we'll do a Q&A now.
Right, okay, I'll sit here for 5 minutes.
Okay.
I won't disturb you.
Do we have who's handling the mics? Okay, we'll bring the mics to
So, I was wondering about the jurisdiction of the gun laws. I know there's obviously federal jurisdiction and then there's state jurisdiction, but how about municipal jurisdiction? If there's certain areas that are extremely, there's such high crime rates and gun violence, is it possible for a municipality to have laws that might be a little bit different than the rest of the state? Or so places that need to be a little bit more restrictive can implement laws like that by a municipality rather than a state?
There are there are preemption issues where, a municipality would not be able to have a total ban on guns, and the Heller decision, I think, it kind of spoke to that a little bit, particularly at the time DC did have a total ban, as did Chicago. And both bans were ultimately determined not to be constitutional. But municipalities do have discharge ordinances and a host of other things that do talk to, what you can and can't do with a gun in a municipality. I mean, in a densely populated area, you can't go and hunt in your backyard and discharge a weapon. In New Jersey, we do currently have, I believe, the strictest gun laws in the nation. Unfortunately, most of the inner city gun violence that you do see does stem from illegal weapons. And so it's something that I think even if legal to do a total ban, I don't know if it would necessarily curb some of what we're seeing in the inner city violence type of situations.
I also want to say, I know that New York City has stricter gun laws than the rest of New York State about concealed carry. I just happen to know from being from the New York area. And in terms of Newark, the gun violence in Newark is actually only from a couple of zip codes even. It's not like the whole city is dangerous or the whole city has an increased rate of gun violence. So even a city ordinance wouldn't necessarily, like she said, make a difference in those small pockets of violence.
Raise your hand.
Hi. So I have more of a comment, rather a question. I want to share with you that we at Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, which falls under the umbrella of Everytown for Gun Safety, have worked hard and continue to work hard. And in 2018, I want to share with everyone that it was a pivotal year for gun safety. We defeated the NRA's dangerous agenda in state houses across the country. We passed 30 gun safety laws in 17 states. We elected more than 1,000 gun sense candidates across the country and a gun sense majority to the House. So we are changing this narrative. And I want everyone to understand this here, that we are the boots on the ground opposition to the extreme agenda to the NRA lobby. We welcome you to join us. Text JOIN to 64433 because we are making America a place that will be safe for all of us. It will happen, I promise you.
I just want to say something. So many people have questions. We'll try to keep any statements very brief. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Fine. I'm a sophomore at Ridgewood High School. I'm also the leader of Students Demand Action Bergen County. I have a question for Assemblywoman Shapizi. First, I want to thank you for coming here and talking about your story of gun violence and your work in the State Assembly. There's a bill in the State Assembly Bill 3696 that requires the safe storage of firearms. It requires by law that you need to lock up your gun when you're not using it. And this way it would prevent, God forbid, a student who is not the owner of their parent's gun from taking their parent's gun and, God forbid, using it to commit suicide or bring it to school. What do you think about that kind of legislation? Do you support it?
I actually agreed to co-sponsor. I don't know if it's that exact bill, but it's a bill that deals specifically with access of weapons that are not stored properly to any child, where the current age, I believe, is like 14 or 15, and the bill I sponsored goes all the way up to 17, 18. So I think not only would I support it, but if it's not that particular bill, I'm the sponsor of one that's very similar to it.
Thank you so much for the support.
You're welcome.
Thank you. My name is Bonnie Benowitz for Grandmoms for Gun Sense in America. We represent another generation of support for gun sense. I have a quick comment and then a question. Not to disagree, but I was under the impression that Students Demand Action did an excellent job for voter turnout, going to schools and colleges and reaching young people who have never been reached before. So I see it perhaps in a little different way and applaud their efforts. My question focuses on the American College of Physicians' recent publication in November, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which it was a very comprehensive publication about gun violence as a public health crisis. And I was wondering if there was any information as a follow-up to that publication.
I don't know of any information that's a follow-up to that. I think that there's a lot of different physician groups that have put forth consensus statements or articles like that, and they all pretty much say the same thing. So they try to stay out of politics and basically emphasize that physicians are against gun injuries and against bullet holes, not necessarily against firearms themselves.
Okay, thank you.
My question is about the Second Amendment and the analysis. There's been a recent lexical study. They're digitizing all the old documents, and they found basically that bear arms in those days was almost universally used in a military context, which seems to imply that the amendment was not done for individual rights, but for the militia. Are you aware of that, and have you any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I am. Though this can get into a much larger discussion about how one interprets the Constitution, and the problem is that those sorts of statistical accounts of how language was used doesn't necessarily answer the question of how, well, it doesn't necessarily answer two questions. One is, how is it used in the context of a specific legal tradition, right? So the Second Amendment isn't just using random words, it comes out of a specific legal tradition. And second, even apart from the legal tradition, it doesn't answer the question of what those words mean in that context. There are lots of words that in most of their uses mean one thing, in a particular context mean something quite different.
But it would have meant that they took the way it's almost universally used and somehow meant it to mean something different. That doesn't make much sense.
Maybe, or maybe not. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things I tell my students in constitutional law is that interpreting legal language is not a question of fact, right? There are no set of facts that can answer the question. There are judgments that need to be made. It's very unusual that there's a set of facts that can resolve it.
Can I just add really fast that the NRA leadership and the gun lobby at this point doesn't care what the facts are around the Second Amendment either. That after Parkland, there was a panel and a spokesperson for the NRA was asked, the Second Amendment says well-regulated militia. What do you consider a well-regulated militia? And she said, any person who wants to defend themselves. So it's really important, those questions, and also important to know that they don't really care what the answer is.
Hi, my name is Ron Schwartz. I'm treasurer of the Bergen County Brady Campaign. A couple other folks are here from the Brady Campaign as well. I have two questions for you. One is, we learned that the federal Congress has restricted the CDC from doing research in relation to the health effects of gun violence. Why can't the states take over more of that role if the federal government is not going to finance this important research, given how important it is? Why can't the states like New Jersey finance some of the research? That's one question. Second question is, in my view, the NRA is so politically powerful and important because, one, money, and two, they threaten to primary a lot of legislators who are even thinking of voting for reasonable gun control legislation. How do we counteract that tremendous NRA political power from the other side?
Well, Doctor, do you want to talk about the Rutgers?
So Rutgers just recently opened a Center for Gun Violence Research, so that is something that the state is doing to fund gun violence research. But there's not a lot of state funding for research out there. So like I talked about, the NIH is the most well-known, at least in the medical field, for funding research. And I think there's like a trickle-down effect. So when the NIH sets priorities on funding, those sort of trickle down to not only state public funding, but also private funding in terms of what's important. And the other things that I mentioned are that researchers aren't out there. So people aren't going into research gun violence if they know that there's all these obstacles to overcome and there's a lot of barriers and there's a million things to research that are simpler to get done and to get funded. So it's a combination of that.
And unfortunately, the state of New Jersey is broke. It's something whereby, in order to properly do this, would probably need all the hospitals in the state to work in conjunction with one another, with some of the different universities, and come up with an internal mechanism for funding it. I also don't know if you'd get an accurate read just in doing research in New Jersey, because we do have amongst the strictest gun laws. And so if you want to get to the root cause of what's going on nationally, I think you would need a much bigger research study than just New Jersey.
So to speak a little bit more about the Rutgers, it's actually called the New Jersey Center on Gun Violence Research, and Rutgers University is basically functioning in the center. So it's a collaboration from the School of Public Health, the Biomedical and Health Sciences, the School of Criminal Justice, and Rutgers University in Newark, as well as the other campuses in New Brunswick and Camden. So what you're saying is totally accurate. So we can do only so much in the state, but if you look around the country, there's other cities that are very similar to Newark in terms of like having only a few zip codes that have a concentration of violence, and the socioeconomic and social issues that exist in those cities, and that are some of the causes of the areas that have gun violence exist across the country. So the fact that New Jersey has such strict gun laws and there's still these problems here in multiple cities in New Jersey, it would have to be much broader of a research study to try to figure out some of the interventions that can be done and some of the root causes behind these social situations.
And I guess to the second part of your question, I guess I would say that groups like Brady and groups like Moms Demand Action in every town have really held elected officials' feet to the fire, that that gun violence used to be the third rail issue and no one would talk about it, and now you can't not talk about it. If you're running for office, you have to say where you stand on this, and not just gun violence in general, but now there's more specific issues around gun violence, and that's, I think, how we hold our elected officials accountable, and we fight as hard as we are to get the people that are in there to vote for us and not to vote with the gun lobby.
Just a couple of quick thoughts. One is, and I've learned an enormous amount tonight, and I've also had some ideas reinforced, and one of the ideas I've had reinforced is precisely the importance of research. At some level, we need to have evidence-based solutions. And one of the problems with the sort of polarization we've had is that there's a high ratio of rhetoric to actual thinking. And it's research that can help us overcome that. And my suspicion is that ultimately, if there's going to be a solution to this, it's going to have to be some combination of laws, and that's certainly a piece of it, but also public health interventions that don't necessarily have much to do with the law itself, that are institutional rather than legal. And then at some level, there has to be a cultural transformation. because both the laws and the institutional responses can only take you so far. We have a gun-loving culture, which is obviously reinforced by the legal regime we have, but it's not entirely created by it. And the toughest sort of laws are only going to be effective to a point unless the culture itself can be changed. We've seen other aspects of our culture that have had major health implications transformed in really dramatic ways, like smoking, right? Now maybe the gun culture is more entrenched than smoking is, I'm not sure. But in any event, we need to think in an evidence-based way about the combination of all of that. The other just sort of quick point, and it just struck me tonight, because I think a lot about polarization and the problems with polarization. A lot of the people who've studied polarization have noticed that it tends to be overcome most effectively at a local level. People tend to be most reasonable when they're actually each other's neighbors. And they might disagree, but they can still try to reach some sort of consensus. So it's not surprising that a lot of progress, to the extent that progress has been made at the state level. But the paradox is exactly what we've been talking about. The paradox is that we're a single country where people can take guns across state borders. So whatever happens at the state level can't be the end of it. It has to be the beginning of some larger effort. And at some point, the hardest nut to crack, because the polarization is most extreme, is going to have to be at the national level. So to the extent that we're worried about laws, we have to see what's going on in these sort of very productive state efforts as simply being one stepping stone. And then we have to see the law itself, as I said a minute ago, as simply one part of a much larger complex of solutions. As a lawyer, I'm sort of embarrassed to say the law, one way or the other, is not always the determinant of things. It's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the entire puzzle.
How many people have questions, so we have a sense? I want to get as many of you. Okay, that'll be the last question, because that's the only hand I see raised.
Hi. You talked about culture, you talked about polarization and changing things at the local level, and I'm wondering if any of you had heard, I don't know, it was a radio broadcast, and it might have been several years ago, about reaching gangs through their mothers and putting all these guys in a room, or girls in a room, with their mothers, and their mothers saying, don't do this, you know. And I'm wondering if Moms is involved in anything like that at maybe an inner city level or reaching out to gangs that way, or if anybody else who's worked with city populations or communities where that culture maybe can be affected at the start, at the home.
There is currently an effort within the state. Some of the research that has been done indicates that there is a much larger percentage of both the mass shootings as well as the inner city violence amongst people from broken homes, no father figures, and it's trying to establish healthy male mentoring programs in conjunction with some, the mothers as well, but generally you'll find a much stronger mother-grandmother type of relationship and not a strong male mentor type relationship. So there are programs that have come through. I sit on a couple of the economic justice, social justice type of committees, and we've been having a lot of different discussions about how to better educate, better provide those sort of resources as well, to have strong role models. And I don't know if...
We have a survivors network. We have lots of survivors in New Jersey, some of which have not lost their children, but children have been killed by a gun. There are groups that we work with, like Cure for Camden, that work more directly in the community. We're looking to work more directly in communities. That's one of our main goals for the year. But definitely, and there are groups I've read about in Chicago and Philly and inner cities that have pastors and volunteers that literally just walk and go, okay, these two groups are having a disagreement, give me the gun. And, and they just are really boots on the ground for that stuff. So we're trying to get in there more because I agree with you.
There's a lot of community-based and hospital-based violence and intervention programs. The issue, I think, is that the problem is complex. So it's not, I've spoken to mothers that have lost multiple children to gun violence, and they're usually the people that we see in Newark either were shot before or know someone that was shot or killed. So it's not as if people that are the victims of gun violence in that area don't think it's going to happen to them or don't know that it's happening to their peers. But I think we have to remember that it's not just about desire, right? Like, so nobody wants to get shot, nobody wants to get killed by a gun, but when the options in your circle put you in a situation where that's something that can happen, then saying that that's something that you don't want to happen isn't enough to get out of that situation.
Okay, before we close, I want to make a couple of announcements. Apropos of the topic tonight, which I think they did a fabulous job. I learned a lot. The Bergen County Players is running a play right now in Oradell at their theater called Church and State, and it's all about the discussion of the gun issue. And I happened to get to see it, very luckily, and it was phenomenal. So if you want to pursue this in the Playhouse, it's a great play. I recommend it. And I want to make another announcement. The League of Women Voters and its sponsors, Fair Districts, and the Network for Responsible Public Policy will be holding a redistricting reform for a Fairer New Jersey public forum here on January 28th. Same at 6:30, not 7:30, 6:30. So that should be interesting too. Hope you can come to that. And please go to the NFRPP website. We're trying to update regularly about the various programs we have, and we have a bunch in the pipeline that are pretty interesting. A couple of flyers are still out on the table if you want to take them, but check in with us regularly. And again, thank you for coming, and thank these fabulous people.